The woman walked into the police station, holding a photograph that was already creased from being folded too many times. "My son is missing," she said calmly. "He hasn't come home." Her voice didn't shake, her hands didn't tremble. She spoke with the quiet certainty of a mother who had been waiting for someone else to notice what she already knew. The officer asked the usual questions: name, age, last known location. She answered every one of them perfectly. Then she paused. "I think something bad happened," she added, her eyes drifting toward the floor. "I can feel it." That feeling would later haunt everyone involved, because the police already knew her son. They had been to her house before. They had spoken to neighbors. They had read the medical reports, and they knew something the woman could no longer remember. Her son wasn't missing. He had been dead for months. And according to evidence collected during a prior welfare check, the person responsible had been standing in front of them the entire time. The mother. Not out of cruelty, not out of rage, out of confusion. As officers escorted her gently into an interview room, one of them noticed something unsettling. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't lying. She genuinely believed her son had vanished. Which raised a far more disturbing question. What happens when someone commits an irreversible crime and then forgets it ever happened? Because if the mind erases guilt, does responsibility disappear with it? And how do you investigate a murder when the suspect wakes up every morning believing she's still waiting for her child to come home? This was not a case about violence. It was a case about memory, and about how the most dangerous crimes inside a family aren't always driven by hatred, but by loss, confusion, and a truth that resurfaces only in fragments. Cases like this rarely begin with sirens. They begin with routines, medication schedules taped to refrigerators, neighbors who keep an extra key, officers who recognize an address before they arrive. When Alzheimer's enters a home, time fractures. Days repeat, nights blur. Familiar faces become strangers, and strangers feel threatening. This case unfolded inside that fracture. The woman who reported her son missing was known to social services. She had been diagnosed years earlier. Her son had moved back home to care for her, managing appointments, cooking meals, answering the same questions dozens of times a day without complaint. To outsiders, it looked like devotion. To the disease, it was proximity. Before we continue, if you're drawn to stories that explore crimes inside families, cases shaped by psychology, illness, and decisions that don't fit simple labels, subscribe to Crimes Within. This channel focuses on investigations where the truth isn't loud, and justice must navigate memory, denial, and silence. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? These cases don't belong to one country or one legal system. They happen wherever families are left alone, with conditions they don't fully understand. In the chapters ahead, you'll hear how police reopened a case they thought was closed, why neighbors noticed something was wrong long before anyone called for help, and how evidence began to surface not in dramatic confessions, but in forgotten rooms, routine logs, and moments the mother could no longer place in time. Most disturbing of all, you'll learn how the investigation forced officers to confront a question no training manual prepares them for. Can someone be guilty of a crime they no longer remember committing? And if memory erases intent, what does justice look like when the truth returns only in pieces? This story isn't about punishment. It's about responsibility. When memory fails, when family collapses inward, and when the past refuses to stay buried, even if the mind does. The address was familiar. 2 officers recognized it the moment the call came in, not because of prior violence, but because of paperwork. Welfare checks, medication concerns, reports filed and closed without incident. The kind of file that grows quietly over time, never urgent enough to demand action, yet never clean enough to disappear. The house sat at the end of a narrow street, trimmed hedges hiding peeling paint. A place that suggested routine more than chaos. When the officers arrived, the front door was already unlocked. The mother stood in the living room, still holding the photograph. "This is him," she said, lifting it again as if repetition might summon clarity. He was supposed to be back by now. The photo showed a man in his late 30s. Tired eyes, a practiced smile. Someone used to explaining himself patiently. Her son. The officers asked when she had last seen him. She answered with confidence. "Yesterday morning," she said. "He said he was going to the store." One officer wrote it down. The other looked around the room. There were no shoes by the door that belonged to a second person, no jacket hanging on the rack, no half-finished coffee on the counter. The house felt singular, as if only one life had been moving through it for a long time. They asked permission to look around. The mother agreed immediately. She followed them, narrating the house as if giving a tour to guests she had just met. "This is his room," she said, opening a door. The room was empty. Not recently empty, not cleaned out. Empty in a way that suggested no one had slept there in months. Dust layered the nightstand. The bed was stripped down to the mattress. The closet held a single hanger. One officer exchanged a glance with the other. They asked the mother how long her son had lived there. "All his life," she replied. "He never left me." That answer was both sincere and incorrect. Records showed the son had moved back in 3 years earlier, after her diagnosis worsened. He had given up his apartment, reduced his hours at work, assumed full-time caregiving responsibilities without formal support. Neighbors described him as patient, quiet, reliable. "He'd wave every morning," one said later, "always tired, never complained." The officers returned to the living room and asked gently whether anyone else visited the house regularly. "No," the mother said. "Just him." The officer asked about doctors, nurses, home care. She frowned. "I don't need help," she said sharply. "I'm fine." The shift was subtle, but important. Confusion didn't always present as disorientation. Sometimes it presented as defensiveness. The officers asked if she was taking her medication. She nodded. They checked the pill organizer on the kitchen counter. It was full, every day, unchanged. The timeline began to fracture. They asked the mother when she had last spoken to her son on the phone. She hesitated. "He doesn't like phones," she said finally. Another deflection. They stepped outside to make calls. Hospital admissions, employer records, cell phone pings. Nothing recent. The last confirmed activity tied to the son was months earlier. A pharmacy pickup made in his name. After that, silence. No bank transactions, no employment records, no digital footprint. It was as if he had stepped out of time. The officers returned inside and sat across from the mother at the kitchen table. "Ma'am," one of them said carefully, "do you remember us coming here before?" She smiled politely. "I don't think so," but they had. 6 months earlier, a neighbor had called after hearing shouting late at night. When officers arrived, they found the son agitated, trying to calm his mother, who was convinced he was an intruder. She had been holding a heavy object. The report noted confusion. No injuries. No charges. The case had been closed. Now it reopened itself. They asked the mother what had happened that night. Her expression softened. "Oh," she said, "that was when a man broke in." The officers waited. "He looked like my son," she continued. "But I knew it wasn't him. My son would never scare me like that." The officers felt the weight of it settle. The disease had rewritten familiarity into threat. They asked where the man had gone. She shrugged. "He left." They asked if she remembered calling for help. She shook her head. Then she looked down at the photograph again. "I just want my boy to come home," she said. One officer asked a question that changed the investigation. "Do you remember anything after that night?" She hesitated longer this time. "I remember cleaning," she said slowly. "I remember being tired." The officers asked what she cleaned. Her brow furrowed. "I don't remember." They requested a forensic unit, not as an accusation, but as procedure. The mother watched them move through the house with mild curiosity, as if observing strangers rearranging furniture she didn't fully recognize. In the basement, behind a locked door the mother insisted had always been closed, they found evidence that redefined the word missing. Not graphic, not chaotic, methodical, wrapped carefully, preserved by accident rather than intent. The son had never gone to the store. He had never left. The mother was taken into protective custody, not in handcuffs, but with a blanket around her shoulders. She asked the same question 3 times on the way to the station. "Did you find him?" No one answered, because the truth had already begun to unravel, and it would do so slowly, painfully, as memory fought reality in fragments that neither law nor medicine could fully reconcile. And the investigation had only just begun. The interview room was quiet in a way that unsettled even seasoned detectives. The mother sat with her hands folded neatly on the table, posture straight, eyes attentive. She looked like someone waiting for instructions, not someone suspected of a violent crime. When the detective introduced himself, she smiled and nodded, repeating his name aloud as if trying to anchor it in place. "I'm glad you're here," she said. "Maybe you can help me find my son." The detective didn't correct her. He had already read the medical file. Advanced Alzheimer's, significant short-term memory loss, episodes of paranoia, moments of lucidity followed by sudden disorientation. Interrogation, in the traditional sense, was impossible, so he began somewhere safer. "Tell me about your son," he said. Her face softened instantly. "Oh, he's a good boy," she replied. "Always worried about me. Too much sometimes." She laughed quietly, then stopped. "Is he in trouble?" she asked. The detective redirected gently. He asked about daily routines, meals, medications, what time her son usually came home. She answered confidently, but the details contradicted one another. Breakfast was sometimes dinner. Days slipped backward into weeks that didn't exist. Still, one thing remained consistent. She believed her son was alive, and she believed he had left the house voluntarily. When the detective asked about the night neighbors had reported shouting, her demeanor changed. Not to fear, but to irritation. "I told him to leave," she said sharply. "I didn't know who he was." "Who did you think he was?" the detective asked. She stared at the table. "Someone pretending," she said. "Someone trying to trick me." The detective paused. "What do you do when someone scares you in your own home?" he asked. She hesitated, then answered slowly. "You protect yourself." That sentence landed heavily in the room. They showed her a photograph from the welfare check 6 months earlier. She studied it carefully. "That's my house," she said. "But I don't remember this." They asked about the basement. Her eyes flickered. "I don't go down there," she said quickly. "It's not safe." "Why?" the detective asked. "I don't know," she replied. "I just know it's not." The medical examiner's report was reviewed alongside her statements. The timeline aligned with the welfare check. The cause of death was consistent with blunt force trauma, an object readily accessible in the home. The most disturbing part wasn't the violence. It was the absence of concealment. There was no attempt to flee, no attempt to fabricate a story, no effort to avoid discovery beyond locking a door she no longer remembered opening. Her mind had done what her hands could not. It had buried the event entirely. As the interview continued, fragments began to surface, not as memories, but as sensations. She spoke of a loud noise she didn't like to think about, of feeling scared in her own living room, of a man who wouldn't leave when she asked him to. "He looked like my son," she said again, "but my son would never hurt me." The detective understood then. Her brain had rewritten the story to preserve safety. In her mind, the threat had been external. The protector, her son, had vanished afterward. It was the only version that allowed her to sleep. Later that day, the detective met with prosecutors and medical experts. The question wasn't whether the mother had caused her son's death. The question was whether she understood it. Competency evaluations were ordered. Psychiatric assessments confirmed what everyone already knew. She was not capable of recalling or comprehending the event in any meaningful way. Legally, the case collapsed into a grey space. Morally, it widened. Neighbors were informed. Some cried. Others felt guilt settle in. The signs they hadn't recognized, the calls they hadn't made sooner. One neighbor said it quietly. He was trying to protect her, and she was trying to protect herself. There was no villain that fit comfortably. The mother was transferred to a secured memory care facility. When staff explained why she was there, she nodded politely. "How long will I be staying?" she asked. They didn't answer directly. That night she asked a nurse the same question, and the next morning she asked again. Every day she asked about her son. Sometimes she said he was missing. Sometimes she said he hadn't called. Sometimes she asked if anyone had seen him. No one ever told her the full truth, because telling her would mean telling her for the first time, over and over again. The detective visited the facility once, weeks later. He watched from the hallway as she sat by a window, folding the same photograph repeatedly, smoothing the creases, then folding it again. She looked peaceful. That disturbed him more than anger ever could, because justice depends on memory. And memory in this case had chosen mercy over truth. The system closed the file as resolved. But nothing about it felt finished. The case did not end when the file was closed. It only stopped being loud. Inside the department, the investigation was marked resolved, but no one used the word out loud. Resolved suggested clarity, suggested balance, suggested that the outcome made sense to the people who had carried it. This one didn't. The prosecutor assigned to review the case spent hours staring at the timeline, searching for a place where intent could be measured. That was the legal hinge. Without intent, there was no conventional crime, only an irreversible outcome shaped by illness. The law was built to weigh decisions. Alzheimer's erased them. Medical experts testified that the mother's cognitive decline had likely reached a stage where threat perception could override recognition. To her, the man in her living room that night had not been a son. He had been an intruder wearing a familiar face. That distinction mattered because the justice system did not know how to punish a disease. Charges were declined. Instead, the state pursued civil commitment, framing the outcome not as accountability, but as protection of the woman and of others. The decision was legally sound. Emotionally, it landed like a fracture. The son's employer was notified. His job was officially listed as voluntarily abandoned. His bank accounts were frozen, then closed. His name slowly disappeared from systems designed to track the living. The quiet, bureaucratic erasure felt colder than any verdict. Neighbors struggled with the aftermath in their own ways. Some avoided the house entirely, others brought flowers that no one collected. A few admitted privately that they had noticed changes months earlier. Raised voices, lights on at odd hours, the son's increasing exhaustion. No one had known what to do with that knowledge. Social services reviewed their involvement. On paper, protocols had been followed. The mother had been assessed. Resources had been offered. The son had declined additional assistance, insisting he could manage. Caregiving, investigators later noted, often fails in silence, especially when love disguises collapse. The detective assigned to the case attended a multidisciplinary review weeks later. Psychiatrists, social workers, legal consultants, all trying to extract lessons from something that resisted classification. One psychiatrist summarized the core problem plainly. We expect memory to anchor responsibility. When memory dissolves, responsibility becomes unstable. That instability unsettled everyone, because it meant the line between victim and perpetrator was no longer fixed. It shifted depending on the moment, the memory, the symptom. The mother, now in secured care, remained unaware of the legal debate surrounding her. She asked about her son daily, sometimes hourly. Staff developed a script, gentle deflections designed to soothe rather than correct. "He's safe," they would say. "He's busy today. He'll visit soon." Each answer was temporary because the question always returned. The detective visited again months later, driven by something he couldn't name. He watched as the mother interacted with another resident, offering reassurance in a voice that sounded like instinct rather than recollection. "You'll be okay," she said to the woman beside her. "Your family loves you." The detective felt a tightening in his chest. Love had never been absent from this case. That was the problem. The son's friends eventually came forward. They described his isolation, his reluctance to ask for help, his fear that institutionalizing his mother would feel like betrayal. "He kept saying she'd never forgive him," one friend recalled. "I don't think he realized she might not remember forgiving him at all." That realization reframed the tragedy. The son hadn't failed his mother. He had stayed too long trying not to fail her. Advocacy groups later cited the case in discussions about caregiver burnout and neurodegenerative disease. Quietly, without names, without photographs, the goal wasn't awareness, it was prevention. Because this case wasn't rare, it was simply extreme. Investigators began re-examining prior welfare checks involving cognitive decline, not to assign blame, but to identify patterns, moments where intervention might have arrived earlier, softer, safer. Too often, it hadn't. The house was eventually sold, renovated. New people moved in without knowing what had happened there. The basement door was replaced, painted over, its history sealed behind drywall and fresh lighting. But among those who knew the story, it lingered. Not as a horror, as a warning that families can become crime scenes without intent, that illness can turn protection into danger, that waiting too long to ask for help can cost more than independence. The detective closed his notes one final time, aware that no future case would ever feel simple again. Because once you investigate a crime where memory is the missing weapon, you begin to see fragility everywhere, and you realize something unsettling. Sometimes the most devastating crimes within a family are not driven by hatred or greed, but by love stretched beyond its limits until it breaks. The story reached the public without ever fully revealing itself. A brief article appeared in the local paper, carefully worded, stripped of names, focused on systemic failure rather than personal tragedy. It described a caregiver found deceased in the home of a parent with advanced Alzheimer's, and a subsequent review of welfare check procedures. There were no photographs, no quotes from family, no headlines strong enough to capture the truth. And yet, people recognized themselves in it. Phone lines at caregiver support organizations lit up in the days that followed. Sons, daughters, spouses, all asking versions of the same question. How do you know when love is no longer enough? No one had a satisfying answer. The ethical debate unfolded quietly, mostly among professionals. Was it right to withhold the truth from the mother indefinitely? Was it ethical to prioritize emotional stability over factual awareness? Did protecting her from guilt also erase the son's right to be acknowledged as a victim? Philosophers and clinicians disagreed. One camp argued that truth, even painful truth, preserved dignity. The other countered that repeating trauma to a mind incapable of retaining it was cruelty disguised as principle. In the end, practicality won. The mother was never told. Her days followed a gentle loop. Meals, activities, the same photograph folded and unfolded. Sometimes she would hum while doing it, a melody staff couldn't place. Other times, she would ask a nurse if her son had called. "He's doing well," they would say. And for a moment, she believed it. The legal system moved on. No trial, no sentencing, no public reckoning. The file remained closed, referenced only in internal trainings and academic discussions about criminal responsibility and cognitive decline. But the people involved did not move on so easily. The detective found himself noticing small things in other cases: hesitation in caregivers' voices, defensive explanations, exhaustion masquerading as competence. He began asking different questions during welfare checks. Not, "Are you okay?" but "Who helps you when you're not?" Sometimes that question opened doors. Sometimes it didn't. The son's death certificate listed the cause plainly, but his life was harder to summarize. Friends gathered privately months later, sharing stories that revealed how narrow his world had become. Work, home, appointments, sleep, repeat. He had vanished long before his body was discovered. That realization carried weight. Caregiver advocacy groups began using anonymized versions of the case in training sessions. The focus wasn't blame, it was thresholds, recognizing when responsibility exceeds what one person can safely hold. Caregiving is not a moral test, one trainer emphasized. It's a medical reality. The mother's condition continued to decline, language fragmented, recognition faded. Eventually, even the photograph lost its meaning. She still folded it, but no longer asked whose face it showed. Staff noted the change in her chart. The detective visited once more, standing at a distance as she stared out the window, expression neutral, unburdened by questions she could no longer form. For the first time, he wondered whether forgetting had been the most merciful outcome available. But mercy did not erase loss. The absence of a courtroom left a gap where grief had nowhere to go. There was no verdict to argue with, no sentence to debate, no apology to reject or accept. Only an ending that refused to resolve cleanly. Years later, the case resurfaced briefly when a similar incident occurred in another state. Different family, same illness. Similar outcome narrowly avoided after a social worker intervened early. That intervention was cited as a success, but success felt fragile, because prevention relies on noticing what is easy to ignore. The detective, now nearing retirement, kept a copy of the case summary in his desk drawer. He didn't reread it often. He didn't need to. It had altered the way he understood crime, not as something that always begins with intent, but sometimes with erosion, with love distorted by fear, with illness rewriting relationships until recognition becomes unreliable. He retired quietly, no ceremony tied to this case, no mention of it in his final review. But when asked what case stayed with him the longest, he answered without hesitation. "The one where no one meant for anyone to die," he said. That answer unsettled people, because it challenged a comforting belief that crimes within families are born from cruelty or greed, that monsters look different from caregivers, that memory can be trusted to preserve truth. This case dismantled that belief, piece by piece. It showed how fragile identity becomes when memory fails, how responsibility blurs when intent dissolves, how justice struggles when the truth cannot remain present long enough to confront. And it left behind a question no policy could fully answer. When a crime is committed by a mind that can no longer remember it, who carries the weight of what happened? The system filed its reports. The facility kept its routines. The world moved forward. But somewhere between forgetting and knowing, a family had collapsed inward, quietly, without malice, leaving behind a story that refused to be simplified. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling part of all. The case should have ended there. Legally, it had. Administratively, it was finished. But inside the department, something lingered, an unease that didn't fit neatly into reports or training modules. The absence of a trial had left questions unanswered, not because evidence was lacking, but because meaning was. The detective assigned to the case found himself returning to one detail repeatedly: the son's decision to keep caring for his mother alone. On paper, he had options: in-home assistance, respite care, memory care facilities. None of those paths were easy, but they existed, and yet he had avoided them all. Friends explained why. He was terrified of being judged, one said, by neighbors, by relatives, by her. The mother, in her moments of clarity, had been vocal about one thing. She never wanted to be put away. She repeated that phrase often, long before the disease progressed. The son had absorbed it as a promise. Breaking that promise felt worse than exhaustion. Breaking it felt like abandonment. That dynamic, promise versus safety, appeared again and again in caregiver-related fatalities. Investigators reviewing similar cases noticed a pattern. Escalation rarely came from anger. It came from isolation. The son's world had shrunk until there was no margin left for error. Neighbors recalled hearing him apologize to his mother late at night. Not argue, apologize. They heard him explaining things repeatedly, who he was, why he was there, why she could trust him. That repetition was not sustainable. Medical experts explained it bluntly. As Alzheimer's advances, the brain's threat detection system often remains intact longer than recognition. Familiar faces can trigger fear when memory fails. The result is a paradox. Those closest become the most frightening. The son had been living inside that paradox. The welfare check 6 months before the incident took on new weight. Officers had noted agitation but saw no immediate danger. The son had insisted he was managing. He was articulate, calm, convincing, too convincing. Caregivers often learn to minimize risk, not out of denial but out of necessity. Admitting the danger would require change. Change would require resources, permission, and acceptance of loss. He had none of those. The detective requested a secondary review of similar cases statewide, not to reopen investigations, but to map warning signs. What emerged was unsettling. Many cases included prior welfare checks that ended without intervention because the caregiver appeared functional. Functionality, however, was not the same as safety. The system had been trained to look for violence. It had missed exhaustion. In professional circles, the case began to be referenced informally, not as an anomaly, but as a cautionary tale. Training sessions emphasized earlier intervention when cognitive decline intersected with caregiver isolation. Still, the changes were incremental, because cases like this resisted easy fixes. Meanwhile, the mother's condition progressed. Staff noted fewer verbalizations, more agitation in unfamiliar settings. She no longer asked about her son consistently. Sometimes she mistook other residents for relatives long gone. The photograph disappeared from her hands. No one knew where it went. A nurse found it weeks later in a drawer, folded so tightly the image was barely visible. When shown to the mother, she stared at it without recognition. "That's a nice man," she said. That moment haunted the staff. The detective received the update quietly. He wrote a note in his file margin, "Identity outlasts memory until it doesn't." The son's absence became more pronounced as time passed. Without a public narrative, there was no memorial, no obituary that told the truth. His death lived in footnotes, in anonymized case studies, in whispered conversations among professionals. He had been erased twice, first by illness, then by process. The detective struggled with that. In his career, justice had often meant exposure, naming, public acknowledgement. Here, privacy had protected one person at the cost of another's visibility. It was the right choice, but it still felt wrong. Years later, when a junior officer asked him about the most difficult aspect of family-related crimes, he answered without hesitation. "It's when everyone is telling the truth," he said, "and the truth still destroys someone." The officer didn't understand at first. He would, because crimes within families rarely follow the shapes people expect. They aren't always driven by greed or resentment. Sometimes they are driven by devotion taken too far, by promises made without understanding what time will demand in return. The mother had not wanted to hurt her son. The son had not wanted to leave her. and the system had not wanted to intervene prematurely. Those intentions collided in a moment when memory failed and fear took control. The result was irreversible. The detective closed the secondary review with recommendations that would never be perfect. Early intervention, mandatory caregiver evaluations, better public education about neurodegenerative disease, necessary steps, but not guarantees, because at the center of the case was something no policy could resolve: the human tendency to wait, to hope, to believe love alone will be enough. In this case, it wasn't. And the cost of realizing that came too late for everyone involved. The case quietly crossed state lines without ever becoming famous. It appeared in academic journals under sterile titles about cognitive impairment and criminal responsibility. It surfaced in closed-door conferences where prosecutors, neurologists, and ethicists debated scenarios no one wanted to imagine happening in their own families. But outside those rooms, life went on. That disconnect, the way something so devastating could exist almost invisibly, began to trouble the detective more than the crime itself. He noticed how often the public needed villains, clear ones, people who chose harm, people who could be condemned without ambiguity. This case offered none of that comfort. It offered a woman whose brain was dissolving in real time, and a son who had stayed when leaving might have saved his life. That complexity made people uncomfortable, so they avoided it. Yet among professionals, the case began to act like a fault line. It exposed gaps in systems that had been built for clearer narratives. The law expected memory to persist. Medicine expected families to adapt. Social services expected caregivers to ask for help. All three assumptions failed at once. A neurologist who reviewed the case spoke candidly during a closed symposium. "Alzheimer's doesn't just erase memory," she said. "It rearranges fear, and fear, when untethered from recognition, is dangerous." That sentence stayed with the detective. Fear untethered from recognition. It explained why the mother had not seen her son that night, why she had seen a threat instead, why the mind, desperate to survive, had rewritten the event entirely afterward. And it explained why the son had been in danger long before that night, living beside someone whose perception could turn without warning. Advocacy groups pushed for legislative changes, mandatory caregiver risk assessments, periodic psychological evaluations for live-in caregivers, automatic escalation protocols when welfare checks occurred more than once at the same address. Some proposals passed, others stalled, because implementing them required resources, and resources required acknowledging how common these situations were. The case was cited again when a similar incident nearly occurred in another county. This time, a social worker intervened after recognizing signs of caregiver collapse. The caregiver was removed temporarily. Support was put in place. No one died. The intervention was labeled a success. But success, the detective noted, was quiet too. The mother from the original case continued to decline. Her chart eventually stopped mentioning her son altogether. There were no more questions, no more folded photographs, just routine. In her final months, staff noted that she became calmer, less agitated, as if something unresolved had loosened its grip. The detective never visited again. He felt it would be intrusive to observe peace built on forgetting. When she passed, the death certificate listed natural causes. There was no reference to the son, no legal link tying them together in that final document. Mother and son ended their lives unconnected on paper. That fact disturbed him deeply, because documents, he had learned, often failed to tell the truest story. The truest story lived in absence, in what people stopped asking, in what systems failed to notice, in what families tried to carry alone until they couldn't. Years later, the detective was invited to speak at a training seminar for new investigators. He was asked to discuss family-related crimes. He chose this case, not in detail, not with names, but as a framework. He told them this: Some crimes don't start with intent. They start with erosion, with small compromises, with waiting one more day to ask for help. He warned them not to confuse calm with safety or love with capacity, and he ended with something that surprised even him. "Sometimes," he said, "the most important question isn't who did this, it's who was left alone too long." The room was silent, because the answer often was everyone. The case never reopened. It didn't need to. Its influence lived elsewhere, in policy drafts, in training slides, in the quiet vigilance of professionals who now asked different questions. But for the detective, the impact was personal. He began volunteering with caregiver support networks after retirement. Not as an investigator, as a listener. He listened to exhaustion, to fear, to people who loved someone whose mind was slipping away and didn't know how to let go. When asked why he did it, he gave a simple answer. "Because waiting can be deadly," he said. And most people don't realize that until it's too late. This case never had a verdict. It never had justice in the way people expected. But it left behind something else, a reckoning with how fragile responsibility becomes when memory fails, and how dangerous it is to mistake endurance for strength. Crimes within families are rarely born in a single moment. They grow, quietly, patiently, until one day the line between protection and harm disappears. And when it does, no one involved is ever the same. By the time the case began influencing policy discussions, the people at its center were already gone from public view. What remained were institutions trying to explain something they were never designed to handle. Legal scholars struggled first. Criminal law depends on continuity, the idea that a person remains the same individual from intent to action to consequence. Alzheimer's fractures that continuity. The woman who struck the blow was not the woman who reported her son missing. One acted under fear, the other under loss. Both were real. Which one should the law recognize? In closed legal forums, the case was used to illustrate a growing problem. Neurodegenerative disease was colliding with an aging population, and the justice system had no coherent framework for crimes committed during cognitive collapse. Existing standards, insanity defenses, competency hearings were blunt tools. They assumed stability. This case had none. Prosecutors admitted privately that a trial would have satisfied public expectation but violated ethical reasoning. Convicting someone incapable of understanding the act would have been symbolic, not corrective. It would have produced a verdict without meaning. But declining prosecution left another wound. The son had no advocate. His death was acknowledged, but never fully examined in a public forum. There was no cross-examination of systems that failed him, no accountability for the months he spent alone, absorbing the strain of caregiving until safety dissolved. That absence bothered social workers more than lawyers. In post-case reviews, one social worker pointed to the welfare check 6 months earlier as the moment that should have changed everything. "We saw agitation," she said. "We didn't see danger." But agitation was the danger. That realization led to revised assessment tools. New checklists asked not only about physical harm, but about caregiver fatigue, isolation, and the presence of paranoia. Questions shifted from, "Is there violence?" to "Is there risk?" The difference mattered. Medical professionals also reassessed assumptions. Alzheimer's was often described as a disease of forgetting. This case reframed it as a disease of misrecognition. The brain doesn't just erase, it rewires. Faces lose meaning. Familiarity becomes unstable. The son had not failed to care properly. He had underestimated how suddenly perception could turn. That underestimation was common. Families often believed love could compensate for decline. Doctors admitted they sometimes reinforced that belief by emphasizing patience over planning. This case forced a harder truth into the conversation. Love without structure can become dangerous. The mother's final years passed quietly. There were no incidents, no outbursts. By the end, she was largely unaware of her surroundings. The disease had flattened emotion into neutrality. Some staff believed this was peace. Others felt it was simply absence. When she died, the facility held a brief service. No family attended. The son had no relatives left willing to claim the connection publicly. 2 lives ended without intersection in the records. The detective attended the service from a distance. He did not feel closure. He felt responsibility, diffuse, unresolved, and shared by many. In the years that followed, he watched similar cases narrowly avoid tragedy because someone intervened earlier. Those moments gave him a sense of purpose, but they didn't erase the original case's impact. It had changed how he understood crime itself. Crime, he realized, was not always an act. Sometimes it was a failure of transition between independence and care, between denial and acceptance, between love and safety. The case also exposed a deeper discomfort. Society preferred to ignore the moments when families collapse inward. When systems expect private households to manage medical crises without adequate support, privacy became a shield and a trap. The phrase "family matter" appeared frequently in old reports. It now read like a warning, because families, left alone with progressive disease, could become sealed environments where danger grew unnoticed. The detective began to speak publicly, not about this case specifically, but about the broader pattern. He urged earlier interventions, mandatory caregiver evaluations, cultural shifts that framed asking for help not as failure, but as survival. Some audiences listened, others resisted. No one wanted to imagine themselves as capable of harm, born from confusion. That was the hardest lesson of all. This case did not involve malice. It involved a moment when the mind could no longer distinguish protection from threat. A moment when love, stripped of recognition, turned inward. Institutions learned from it slowly. Families learned from it unevenly. But the cost had already been paid. The son's life became a data point, a statistic used to justify reforms that arrived too late for him. That knowledge weighed heavily on everyone who touched the case, because prevention often arrives only after loss makes it unavoidable, and because crimes within families rarely announce themselves with violence first. They announce themselves with exhaustion, with confusion, with waiting. And when those signs are ignored, the consequences do not look like crimes at all. They look like tragedies no one meant to create. The final reckoning did not arrive as a decision or a declaration. It arrived as exhaustion. Years after the case had faded from headlines that never truly existed, the institutions involved realized something unsettling. There was no single point of failure to correct, no individual error to discipline, no policy gap that, once closed, could guarantee safety. The tragedy had emerged from overlap, from medical decline intersecting with familial loyalty, from legal frameworks colliding with ethical restraint, from systems designed to react to danger, not to anticipate quiet collapse. That overlap was difficult to address because it demanded humility rather than authority. In internal reviews, one uncomfortable conclusion surfaced repeatedly. The system had relied too heavily on families to self-report crisis. But Alzheimer's does not announce crisis in rational language. It announces it through fear, misrecognition, and denial. And caregivers, bound by love and obligation, are often the last to admit they are overwhelmed. That realization forced a reframing of responsibility. Instead of asking whether caregivers were coping, agencies began asking whether they were safe. Instead of waiting for explicit violence, professionals were encouraged to intervene when patterns of isolation, paranoia, and repeated welfare checks appeared together. Still, the reforms moved slowly, because intervention meant intrusion. And intrusion challenged a deeply held belief that family spaces are private, even when illness turns them dangerous. The case became a quiet reference point for that debate, not cited publicly, but present in the minds of those drafting new guidelines. It shaped training materials with phrases like escalation without intent and risk without malice. These phrases unsettled new investigators. They were meant to. The detective who had followed the case from the beginning was invited to review one of these new training modules. He noticed something missing immediately. "There's no place for grief here," he said. The designers were confused. "This is about prevention," one replied. He nodded. "Yes, but prevention doesn't erase what already happened. If you don't acknowledge that, people will resist these changes. They'll feel accused instead of supported." That comment led to a revision. Training now included sections on moral injury, not just for victims, but for caregivers and responders. The idea was simple but radical. Acknowledge that tragedy can occur even when no one intends harm. That acknowledgement changed tone. It didn't solve everything, but it reduced defensiveness. Families who later encountered intervention were more receptive when it was framed not as judgment, but as protection, as partnership. And in several cases, that shift mattered. The mother's story continued to ripple outward long after her death. In ethics classrooms, students debated whether forgetting absolves guilt. In law schools, professors asked whether accountability requires awareness. There were no consensus answers. But there was consensus on one point. Pretending these cases fit traditional crime models only deepened harm. The son's absence remained the hardest part to reconcile. No memorial bore his name. No court transcript preserved his voice. His life was reconstructed through second-hand descriptions, patient, quiet, devoted. The detective once described him to a colleague as someone who disappeared long before he died. That disappearance, social, emotional, institutional, became a focal point in later discussions. Advocates argued that caregiver invisibility was itself a risk factor, that people who quietly absorb responsibility without complaint are often those in greatest danger. The case forced institutions to ask an uncomfortable question: who do we fail to see because they appear capable? The answer, again and again, was caregivers. As years passed, the reforms inspired by the case blended into broader changes. It became impossible to trace cause and effect precisely, but among those who knew the origin, there was a sense that something fundamental had shifted, not enough, but something. The detective retired with that ambiguity intact. He never sought closure. He understood now that some cases do not resolve, they instruct. When asked in an interview what he would change if he could go back, he answered quietly, "I would have taken exhaustion more seriously," he said. "I would have believed that love could be dangerous when left alone." That statement stayed with those who heard it, because it challenged a comforting narrative that harm requires cruelty, that danger announces itself clearly, that good intentions protect against catastrophic outcomes. This case dismantled those assumptions. It showed that crimes within families can arise from erosion rather than explosion, from memory failing faster than systems can adapt, from waiting too long to admit that something has become unsafe. And it revealed a truth that institutions rarely confront willingly. Some tragedies cannot be prevented by better laws alone. They require earlier compassion, deeper attention, and the courage to intervene before love collapses under the weight of disease. The reckoning then was not about blame. It was about recognition. Recognition that responsibility does not vanish when memory does. Recognition that protection sometimes means stepping in, even when no one asks. Recognition that silence, whether born of devotion or denial, can be lethal. The case never had a verdict, but it delivered one nonetheless. A quiet, enduring judgment on how societies care for those who forget, and those who refuse to leave them alone. The final chapter of the case did not belong to the courtroom, the hospital, or the police department. It belonged to the spaces in between. Years after the file was closed, the ripple effects continued in places no report could capture. In family kitchens, in late-night conversations between spouses caring for aging parents, in the quiet hesitation before someone asked for help, and the louder relief when they finally did. The case had become a reference point without a name. Social workers noticed it first. When evaluating households affected by cognitive decline, they began to sense a familiar tension. The moment when love hardened into obligation, when obligation turned into isolation. The warning signs were subtle, often disguised as competence. He says he's fine. She insists she can handle it. They don't want outsiders involved. Those phrases took on new weight. The Sun's story, though anonymized, circulated among professionals as an example of what happens when endurance is mistaken for strength. He had been strong, he had been present, he had been loving, and none of it had protected him. That realization shifted how responsibility was discussed. The focus moved away from individual failure and towards structural neglect. Why were caregivers expected to shoulder such risk alone? Why did systems wait for explicit danger before acting? The answers were uncomfortable. Because stepping in meant confronting family autonomy, because funding early intervention was harder to justify than reacting to tragedy, because society preferred to believe that private love could manage public illness. The case proved otherwise. In one training session, a senior clinician asked a room full of new social workers a single question. At what point does love become unsafe? The room was silent. There was no universal answer. The mother's story also forced reconsideration of dignity. Many argued that withholding the truth from her preserved peace. Others countered that peace built on forgetting was fragile and incomplete. Yet as her condition advanced, those debates felt increasingly abstract. By the end, she lived entirely in the present moment, unburdened by questions she could no longer form. The staff who cared for her noticed something unexpected. She was gentler. The agitation that once surfaced during moments of confusion had faded. The fear that had once driven her actions no longer had context to feed on. It was as if the mind, stripped of memory, had also released its last defenses. This observation unsettled caregivers, because it suggested that the most dangerous stage of illness was not the end, but the middle. The liminal phase where recognition flickered unpredictably, where fear could erupt without warning. That was when the Sun had been most vulnerable. Advocates began pushing for resources focused specifically on that phase. Transitional support, mandatory respite, proactive evaluations triggered by diagnosis rather than crisis. Some of these proposals were adopted, many were not. But awareness had shifted. The detective, now fully retired, reflected on the case differently with time. Initially, it had felt like failure. Later, like inevitability. Eventually, it became something else entirely, a lesson about limits. He realized that the most important intervention would not have been forceful. It would have been relational, someone checking in regularly. Someone noticing the Sun's exhaustion and naming it before it became dangerous. That absence haunted him. In conversations with former colleagues, he began to speak less about the crime and more about the silence that preceded it. How easy it was for everyone, including professionals, to accept reassurances at face value. He never asked for help, people would say. The detective now challenged that assumption. Sometimes, he replied, not asking is the loudest signal there is. The case also reframed how he understood justice. Justice, he realized, was not always about punishment or resolution. Sometimes it was about preventing the next collapse, and prevention required discomfort. It required entering private spaces before they asked, questioning narratives of self-sufficiency, accepting that love alone does not make a situation safe. These insights filtered slowly into practice, not everywhere, not consistently, but enough to matter. Years after the mother's death, a similar case was flagged early in another region. A caregiver reported increasing confusion and fear in a parent with dementia. Instead of closing the file, social services escalated support immediately. The caregiver was removed temporarily, the parent placed in a controlled environment. No one died. That outcome was recorded as a success. The detective read about it and felt something close to relief, not because it balanced the scales, but because it meant the story had not ended in vain. The son's life, though never publicly memorialized, had altered how others were protected. His absence had forced attention where denial once lived. That was the final quiet transformation of the case. Not redemption, but impact. As institutions continued to adapt, slowly, imperfectly, the case faded further into professional memory. But its lesson remained sharp. Crimes within families do not always announce themselves with intent or malice. Sometimes they arrive when care exceeds capacity, when love persists past safety, when memory fractures and fear fills the gap, and when everyone involved waits for clarity that never comes. The final chapter was not about closure. It was about recognizing that some tragedies cannot be undone, but they can still change what comes next. The last consequences of the case surfaced quietly, years after anyone had stopped actively discussing it. They appeared in statistics. Reports showed a slight increase in early interventions for households affected by advanced cognitive decline. Caregiver fatigue was flagged more often. Welfare checks were no longer treated as isolated events, but as data points in a broader pattern. To an outsider, these changes seemed minor. To those who knew the origin, they were profound, because each small adjustment represented a life that might not end the same way. The son's story, though never publicly named, became part of an internal narrative used to remind professionals why hesitation could be dangerous, why reassurance was not always honesty, why silence could be lethal when misinterpreted as stability. One social worker described it best. This case taught us to stop rewarding endurance. Endurance, they learned, was not strength. It was often a warning. The legal system, too, absorbed lessons. Prosecutors began consulting neurologists earlier in cases involving cognitive decline. Judges were briefed on the stages of Alzheimer's, not just the diagnosis. Language shifted from blame toward capacity. These changes did not erase ambiguity, but they reduced cruelty. The mother's name was eventually removed from internal discussions. She became a symbol rather than a subject. Her story, stripped of identifiers, was easier to teach, but harder to feel. Yet for those who had met her, the memory lingered, not of violence, of confusion, of a woman who believed she was waiting for her son to come home, unaware that her mind had rewritten the moment he never left. That image haunted those closest to the case more than any forensic detail, because it captured the core tragedy. Two people trapped in the same space, moving in opposite psychological directions, one losing recognition, the other losing resilience, and neither had anywhere to go. As time passed, the case began to be referenced less as a crime and more as a failure of timing, too late to intervene gently, too early to justify forceful action, suspended in a window where everything depended on recognition that never came. That window was now the focus of prevention efforts. Recognize earlier, intervene sooner, do not wait for violence to define danger. Still, professionals acknowledged the limits of reform. Not every case would be caught. Not every family would accept help. Not every tragedy could be prevented. But pretending otherwise had proven worse. The detective, reflecting on the case one final time during a recorded interview for internal archives, was asked whether he believed justice had been served. He paused for a long time. "Justice?" he said. "No. Justice assumes balance. This was imbalance from the start." "What about accountability?" the interviewer asked. "That's harder," he replied. Because accountability usually points somewhere. Here it pointed everywhere. The interviewer asked if the case still stayed with him. He nodded. Because it reminds me that the line between care and harm isn't fixed, he said. It moves as people change, and if no one notices that movement, tragedy becomes inevitable. That statement was never published, but it circulated, and it mattered. In the end, the case did not offer comfort. It offered clarity, about fragility, about love stretched too far, about systems that react better than they anticipate. It showed how crimes within families can emerge not from hatred, but from erosion, from waiting, from believing that tomorrow will be easier. It rarely is. The final consequence of the case was not a sentence or a verdict. It was vigilance, a shared, quiet understanding that responsibility does not end when memory fades, and that protection sometimes requires stepping in before anyone asks. That understanding was the closest thing to resolution this story would ever have. This story never offered a villain you could point to. It offered something far more unsettling, a family undone by illness, isolation, and time. A son who stayed when leaving might have saved his life. A mother whose mind rewrote reality to survive its own fear. A system that waited for clarity until clarity no longer existed. Crimes Within is about cases like this, not because they shock, but because they challenge what we believe about responsibility, justice, and love. If stories that explore the darkest corners of family dynamics resonate with you, subscribe to the channel. We focus on cases where truth is uncomfortable, motives are fractured, and the consequences linger long after the headlines fade. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? These stories happen everywhere, often behind closed doors, often unnoticed until it's too late. This case reminds us that danger does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it grows quietly, disguised as devotion, waiting for exhaustion to erase the last line of defense. Remember, asking for help is not failure. Intervening early is not intrusion, and love without limits can become dangerous. Some crimes within families cannot be undone, but they can still teach us how to prevent the next one.